So how different are Brazilian Portuguese and Portuguese Portuguese? Well, pretty different actually, but before we get into exactly how, I think we need to set an example. How different are American English and British English? Well, pretty different, right? Because British people don't pronounce their R's and they drop their T's and their vowels are all different. So they're saying stuff like Manchester United and Americans are like Manchester United, right? Well, what if you're in, I don't know, Boston and you need to, just for the sake of the argument, Pakika and Havaya. This Boston accent is really one of a few Boston accents, but it's also one of many accents across the US that are indeed non-rhotic. That is to say, they don't pronounce their R's at the end of syllables. But that doesn't mean they're not American accents, just like how there's plenty of British accents that do pronounce their R's. So all that is to say, we're painting in very broad strokes here, and we will have to do the same when we're talking about Brazil and Portugal. Brazil, for example, in case you haven't noticed, is really big, and as such, there's a Brazilian different accent spoken there. All right, thank you so much. I'll see y'all later. Have a great one. Okay. Portugal, on the other hand, is much smaller, but Portuguese has been spoken there much longer, and as such, it's had a lot more time to turn into a bunch of different accents as well. That being said, broadly speaking, Brazilian dialects and European dialects do, at the very least, sound very different, and that's in large part due to their vowels. As a general rule of thumb, in Brazilian Portuguese, if a vowel isn't stressed, you'll probably hear it get played around with a little. Like, for example, Belo Horizonte, Recife, Rio de Janeiro. You see how those O's and E's are becoming U's and E's at the end there? The specific ways that those unstressed vowels change varies within Brazil, but the general trend is the same. In Portugal, on the other hand, if they see an unstressed vowel, they're just like... One of the most salient features of European Portuguese is the reduction of unstressed vowels, to the extent that sometimes they're just not even pronounced at all. So a word like this might be príncipe in Brazil, but príncipe in Portugal, or even just príncipe. Or this might be verdade versus verdade, or just verdade. This word also shows off one of the other more famous aspects of Brazilian Portuguese, which is the verdade. These sequences will often get palatalized in Brazilian dialects, so verdade, saudade, incrivelmente. This feature is often associated with the Portuguese spoken in Rio, but it's since spread across a lot of Brazil. But again, not all of Brazil. We're painting in broad strokes, right? Because in the northeast and the south of Brazil, that palatalization doesn't really occur in that way. We can also talk about differences in grammar between Brazilian and European dialect. One of the things you might notice is that these dialects handle the gerund a little differently. For example, if I were to say I am speaking, in Brazil that'd be estou falando, whereas in Portugal that'd be estou a falar. The really interesting difference, in my opinion, though, is that Brazilian dialects will often make much more extensive use of anical-euthon. That is to say, they will more readily break up the structure of a sentence to shift the focus onto what the sentence is actually about. That is to say, they're more topic prominent. Now, all that being said, this is an extremely basic introduction, and I am far from an expert on Portuguese, nor is it my first language. But I do find it extremely interesting, and I hope you look more into it yourself. I'd also like to point out that Brazil and Portugal are far from the only places where Portuguese is spoken. There's an entire video's worth of information to cover about the Portuguese spoken in Angola, Mozambique, Cabo Verde, Timor-Leste, and so on, and well, it's coming soon. For the time being though, muito obrigado.